Rebecca Stanton marched swiftly down the narrow aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the polished cabin floor. Her gaze was ice-cold, her expression one of authority hardened by years of commanding first-class cabins. Passengers instinctively pulled in their arms and legs as she passed, sensing the electric charge in the air. She wasn't merely walking, she was patrolling, eyes sharply scanning each seat as though hunting for something out of place. And suddenly she found it. Her eyes narrowed on a small figure sitting quietly by the window in seat 2A. A young boy named Elijah Bennett, barely 10 years old, calmly staring at the cloud-studded sky outside. His oversized hoodie made him look even smaller, swallowed by the plush leather seat of first class as he nervously twisted the headphone cord in his fingers. Rebecca's pace quickened slightly, her breathing tightening with indignation. She stopped abruptly in front of him, arms crossed sternly. The young boy seemed oblivious at first, lost in thought, until the dark shadow of Rebecca blocked the natural light pouring from the aircraft window. Slowly, Elijah lifted his gaze and met her penetrating stare, instantly sensing that something was terribly wrong. Rebecca tilted her head slightly, a calculated gesture that drew the eyes of every passenger around them. The once bustling first-class cabin fell into a hushed silence, punctuated only by the distant rumble of engines warming up beneath their feet. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "But where exactly are your parents?" Elijah swallowed hard, confusion flickering across his gentle eyes. He shifted uneasily, sensing the gazes of strangers around him, their curiosity now becoming invasive. Still, he steadied himself, his mother's words echoing in his mind. "Always remain calm, always remain polite. I'm traveling by myself," Elijah replied softly but clearly, his voice firm despite the pressure of dozens of eyes upon him. "I have a ticket. This seat was assigned to me." Rebecca scoffed quietly, disbelief painted openly across her stern features. She made no move to examine the ticket Elijah carefully held out. Instead, her eyes narrowed even further, her voice dripping with condescension. "You? Traveling alone? And in first class?" Her tone implied clearly how absurd this was, impossible even. "Let me see your boarding pass." Elijah obediently offered it again, his hand steady despite the growing embarrassment heating his cheeks. Rebecca glanced at it dismissively, barely scanning the paper, then shook her head with a forced sigh. "Look," she said loudly, turning slightly as if performing for an invisible audience, her voice laced with artificial sweetness masking deep disdain. "There must have been some misunderstanding. First-class seats aren't simply handed out like candy. They're reserved for our most valued passengers, for those who have earned their right to sit here, and you clearly do not belong." Elijah felt his chest tighten painfully. His heartbeat quickened, embarrassment turning to humiliation under the growing weight of the cabin's silent judgment. He could feel their eyes on him, passengers leaning subtly into the aisle, whispering softly to one another. Yet no one spoke up, not one person defended him from this unwarranted attack. He felt utterly isolated, small, exposed. "But my ticket," Elijah tried once more, desperately, voice cracking slightly under pressure. "Enough," Rebecca cut him off sharply, raising her palm dismissively. Her voice now carried a sharp edge, cold and harsh. "I won't have a scene made here. Gather your belongings immediately. I'll escort you to a seat that's more suitable." Elijah sat frozen momentarily, stunned by the brutal certainty in her voice. Slowly, painfully aware of every movement, he unbuckled his seatbelt with trembling fingers. He reached under the seat for his small backpack, gripping it tightly, fighting to control the tears that stung behind his eyes. Rebecca stood impatiently, tapping her foot slightly as if to emphasize her irritation. The silence in the cabin deepened, each passenger now fully invested in the quiet drama unfolding. Elijah rose unsteadily to his feet, his legs trembling slightly. His breath caught as he took a hesitant step into the aisle, shoulders slumped in shame, wishing he could simply vanish. Rebecca immediately placed a firm hand on his shoulder, steering him forcefully towards the rear of the aircraft. Passengers turned their heads, watching intently as the small boy was marched past them, some shaking their heads slightly, others averting their eyes uncomfortably, but no one speaking out. As they passed into the economy section, Rebecca pointed to an empty seat in the very last row, a cramped corner beside the restroom. "There," she said, voice devoid of warmth. "This is where you should be." Elijah sat down silently, humiliation burning hotly on his cheeks, heart racing with an emotion he couldn't fully name. Hurt, shame, anger, confusion, all tangled together in an aching knot. He stared down at his hands, avoiding the curious glances from economy-class passengers who had witnessed his public downgrade. Rebecca spun on her heels without another word, heading back towards the front with a satisfied sense of restored order. She did not look back, utterly convinced she had handled the situation appropriately, oblivious to the gravity of the mistake she had just made. But Rebecca Stanton couldn't possibly realize, was that Elijah Bennett was no ordinary passenger. He wasn't merely a child traveling alone. He wasn't someone whose presence could be easily dismissed or forgotten. For what Rebecca had just done was not simply a minor inconvenience. In truth, she had just humiliated the son of Vivian Montgomery, the powerful CEO and owner of the very airline she so proudly represented. And as the plane prepared for takeoff, Rebecca remained blissfully unaware of the impending storm gathering on the horizon. Because thousands of miles away, in a luxurious high-rise office, Vivian Montgomery was already receiving word of her son's mistreatment, her expression darkening into one of quiet, controlled fury. She reached calmly for her phone, her voice low and dangerously steady as she addressed her executive assistant, Lucas Bradford. "Lucas," she said quietly, each syllable sharp and deliberate. "Find out who is responsible for this. I want answers immediately." And with that command, Rebecca Stanton's life was about to irrevocably change. For Elijah Bennett wasn't simply another passenger in seat 2A. He was the one person whose humiliation would trigger a chain reaction, exposing not just Rebecca's prejudice, but an entire system of bias and injustice hidden quietly beneath the polished surface. And what happened next? No one on board that aircraft, not even Rebecca herself, could ever have imagined. Elijah slumped into his new seat at the very back of the plane, heart pounding heavily against his chest. The quiet whispers of passengers followed him like shadows, wrapping around him until the humiliation felt almost suffocating. He glanced at the crumpled ticket in his hand, confirming again what he already knew. His seat, first class 2A. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, alone, embarrassed, and banished to economy as if he were some kind of criminal. At that exact moment, back in first class, Rebecca Stanton returned triumphantly. She brushed off her perfectly pressed uniform, dismissing the curious glances from passengers with a faintly smug smile. She had asserted her authority and restored what she saw as proper order. But Sophie Mitchell, the newest and youngest flight attendant, looked visibly uncomfortable. "Rebecca," Sophie approached cautiously, glancing back toward Elijah's now empty seat. Her voice trembled slightly but remained polite. "Did you double-check that boy's boarding pass? He seemed genuine." Rebecca spun around, irritation clear on her face. She towered slightly over Sophie, her tone sharp and dismissive. "Listen closely, Sophie. I've been managing first-class cabins for 15 years. You're new here. You don't understand how things work yet." "But," Sophie attempted to interject, holding her composure with effort. "His ticket looked legitimate. Shouldn't we at least verify?" Rebecca narrowed her eyes, voice lowering dangerously. "Are you questioning my judgment?" Sophie's shoulders dropped slightly, her voice faltering. "No, I just..." "Good," Rebecca cut in coldly, voice firm enough to carry to nearby passengers. Just follow instructions and leave the decision-making to experienced crew members. Do I make myself clear? Sophie nodded silently, cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she stepped back, effectively silenced. A few rows away, an elderly gentleman, dressed simply but neatly, had been watching the entire incident unfold with growing discomfort. His hands gripped the armrests tightly. After a moment, he stood with deliberate effort, addressing Rebecca directly. "Excuse me, miss." His voice was firm yet gentle. "But I saw the boy's ticket. It was clearly for seat 2A. Shouldn't you at least double-check before moving him?" Rebecca turned slowly, her stare icy enough to silence the cabin once more. She glanced briefly at his simple clothing and scuffed shoes, her judgment clear in her eyes. "Sir," she said coolly, "I appreciate your concern, but as I've already mentioned, I have the situation under control. Please sit down and refrain from interfering with crew operations." The elderly man's face flushed in anger, but seeing her defiant posture and cold gaze, he reluctantly sat back down, shaking his head quietly. Rebecca smiled thinly, satisfied, and promptly instructed Sophie in a voice deliberately audible, "No further refreshments for that passenger. Let's avoid rewarding disruption." Sophie hesitated, a brief flicker of protest in her eyes, but quickly nodded, forced into reluctant compliance. Meanwhile, at the back of the plane, Elijah took out his phone, his fingers shaking slightly. He quickly typed a message. "Mom, the flight attendant made me leave my seat. She said I don't belong in first class. What do I do?" But before he could hit send, his phone screen went black. His heart dropped. The battery was dead. Panic surged momentarily, but Elijah steadied his breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He needed to charge his phone immediately. Turning toward the aisle, he caught sight of Sophie walking through economy, distributing headphones and blankets. He raised his hand politely as Sophie approached. "Excuse me, miss, could I borrow a charger? My phone just died, and I really need to contact my mom." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but Rebecca appeared behind her instantly, intercepting. "We don't provide chargers," she stated sharply, eyes locked onto Elijah with disdain. "Perhaps next time. Prepare yourself better before boarding." Elijah's stomach tightened painfully at her harsh words. He felt utterly trapped, isolated and helpless. Sophie looked apologetically at him, but quickly averted her eyes under Rebecca's cold glare, continuing silently down the aisle. The passengers around Elijah noticed Rebecca's hostility and began whispering. Elijah overheard pieces of their murmurs, comments like, "Must have stolen that ticket. Kids these days, probably using someone else's credit card. He clearly doesn't belong in first class." Each word sliced through Elijah, deeper than the last, making his throat close and his eyes sting with tears he refused to shed. He pressed himself closer to the window, wishing desperately to disappear. He felt as if the entire plane had turned against him, silently judging without knowing his story. Yet through it all, he maintained his mother's calm voice in his mind, reminding him to stay composed, even as his heart ached. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, drawing quiet strength from within, determined not to let Rebecca's cruelty break him. Back in first class, Rebecca leaned casually against the galley wall, smirking slightly, unaware of how dangerously close she was to disaster. Sophie, increasingly uncomfortable, approached again. "Rebecca, shouldn't we at least let the boy charge his phone?" she said quietly, her voice pleading. "He seems genuinely distressed." Rebecca turned, eyes flaring. "And encourage this type of entitled behavior? Absolutely not." Sophie's voice rose slightly, frustration finally edging in. "But what if we're wrong?" Rebecca stepped closer, voice lowered dangerously, her tone icy. "Be careful, Sophie. Your job depends on following orders, not questioning them." Sophie stepped back again, defeated, eyes wide in shock. The rest of the crew pretended not to notice, but the tension within the cabin thickened. At the back, Elijah leaned back into his seat, feeling utterly powerless. The whispers around him continued. He knew he was innocent, yet had no way to prove it. He stared numbly at his hands, the weight of humiliation pressing heavily against him, crushing his small shoulders. Unbeknownst to Elijah, thousands of feet below in a luxury office tower, his mother, Vivian Montgomery, was about to receive an urgent message that would soon change everything. Vivian sat in a conference room, phone vibrating with notifications. As she glanced at the first message from her son, sent just before his battery had died, her heart immediately hardened with a mix of anger and determination. "Mom, the flight attendant made me leave my seat." Vivian calmly stood, silencing the room with a single gesture. Turning to her assistant, Lucas Bradford, she spoke clearly, her voice edged with quiet fury. "Lucas, contact Captain Marcus Donovan immediately. Tell him my son is aboard Flight 217 and is being mistreated by his crew. I want answers now." Lucas nodded urgently, reaching for his phone. Vivian's gaze hardened. Nobody humiliated her son and walked away untouched. Rebecca Stanton had no idea the storm she had just unleashed. Because Elijah Bennett wasn't just a small boy sitting in economy class. He was about to become the catalyst that would expose a hidden culture of injustice, humiliation, and prejudice within the airline, changing lives forever, including Rebecca Stanton's. Rebecca Stanton had never intended to become this person. Sharp-edged, authoritative, and cold. But years of demanding passengers, endless regulations, and relentless pressure from the airline's management had slowly hardened her. It hadn't always been this way. Once, Rebecca had been bright-eyed, enthusiastic, and genuinely passionate about providing warmth and comfort to passengers on their journeys, but that youthful optimism was long buried beneath layer after layer of mistrust and bitterness. Her early years at the airline had been marked by naivety. She remembered vividly one incident, just months after starting as a first-class attendant, when a seemingly innocent passenger had tricked her into granting unauthorized upgrades. The passenger, using forged documents, had defrauded the airline, and when management found out, the blame had fallen squarely on Rebecca. Though she kept her job, the humiliation from senior management haunted her. They reminded her continually, be vigilant, be skeptical, question everything. It was a harsh lesson she internalized deeply. Over time, skepticism hardened into suspicion into prejudice, and prejudice into a stubborn unwillingness to admit mistakes. The more her superiors demanded perfection, the more fiercely she protected herself by projecting an impenetrable wall of authority. Rebecca's fear of humiliation translated into a desperate need for control, an obsession with enforcing order and discipline at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing fairness. As Rebecca stood in the galley now, glancing toward economy class where Elijah had been banished, she rationalized her actions repeatedly. She convinced herself Elijah had to be another example of fraud, a deceitful attempt by someone to exploit the airline's generosity. Her past traumas reinforced this conviction, clouding her judgment. She couldn't afford to doubt herself. Doubt meant weakness. Weakness invited humiliation. Yet, despite her outward confidence, something quietly gnawed at the back of her mind. She quickly silenced it, focusing instead on her routine, regaining control, restoring order. But this lingering discomfort refused to fully vanish, signaling deep within her consciousness that she might have made a critical mistake. In stark contrast, Elijah Bennett sat quietly at the back of the aircraft, taking measured breaths to steady himself. Beneath his calm exterior, his mind raced, trying to piece together why he'd been treated this way. His mother, Vivian Montgomery, always taught him to trust himself, to stand confidently, never allowing anyone to diminish his dignity. But being a 10-year-old alone in an unfamiliar environment made this advice difficult to follow. Elijah wasn't oblivious. He understood clearly what had just transpired. Rebecca Stanton hadn't simply doubted his ticket. She had doubted him, his very right to belong, based purely on how he looked and her own prejudices. Still, Elijah resisted anger. Instead, he observed, analyzing quietly from the back of the plane. He studied the passengers around him, noting their reactions to his humiliation. Some avoided eye contact completely, pretending he wasn't there. Others openly whispered, assuming he couldn't hear their harsh judgments. He saw in their silence and avoidance a reflection of a broader societal issue, people witnessing injustice but refusing to act, hoping someone else might intervene. His mother had warned him about this before, that sometimes the greatest injustices occurred not through cruelty alone, but through the silence of bystanders. Elijah realized, perhaps for the first time in his young life, the deep weight of those words. Yet through this turmoil he found strength in remaining calm, refusing to let humiliation define him. He held on to the certainty of his truth. He belonged. His ticket was real, and the injustice wasn't his to carry. Elijah resolved that when he had the chance, he would speak up, not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced, unheard, or unfairly treated. Quietly, he promised himself to use this painful moment as motivation to fight back against the invisible prejudices that had led him here. Meanwhile, caught in the middle, Sophie Mitchell struggled with her own internal conflict. Sophie was only 6 months into her dream job as a flight attendant, fresh from training and eager to make a positive impact. But watching Rebecca mistreat Elijah and dismiss the elderly man had shaken her deeply. Everything she'd learned in training emphasized compassion, respect, and fairness, but reality proved to be more complicated, especially under the shadow of Rebecca's dominance. Sophie desperately wanted to confront Rebecca, to demand justice for Elijah, but each attempt she made ended in self-doubt. She wondered whether standing up to Rebecca would cost her the job she'd worked so hard for. Rebecca's words echoed harshly in her mind. "You're new here. You don't understand how things work yet." These words wounded Sophie, reinforcing her sense of helplessness. Yet her conscience relentlessly pressed her to speak up, to act. The struggle felt almost physical, a tightening knot of anxiety inside her chest. Each step she took down the aisle became heavier, as if she were carrying the weight of every injustice Rebecca committed. Sophie quietly passed Elijah again, unable to meet his eyes out of guilt. She felt ashamed of herself for not being braver, for not doing more. She wondered if the passengers saw her silence as complicity. The thought terrified her. She didn't want to become someone who witnessed wrongs and chose to remain silent. Still, fear of repercussions paralyzed her into passivity. At that moment, Sophie realized the bitter truth. It wasn't enough to recognize injustice if you didn't have the courage to challenge it. Sophie knew her silence was part of the problem, and the realization hurt deeply. She promised herself this flight would mark a turning point. No matter the risk, next time she saw injustice, she would find her voice. Sophie glanced toward Rebecca, noting her confident facade, understanding now that Rebecca's control stemmed from deep-seated insecurity. But that didn't excuse the cruelty, nor did it erase the consequences of her silence. The three, Rebecca, Elijah, Sophie, sat within the same airplane, yet worlds apart emotionally. Each confronted their own internal battles, shaped by past experiences, insecurities, and ethical dilemmas. And though none knew exactly how the flight would conclude, each sensed a dramatic turning point lay ahead, ready to test their courage, force them into uncomfortable self-reflection, and ultimately define the type of people they would become. Rebecca, stubbornly defensive; Elijah, resiliently courageous; Sophie, desperately conflicted. 3 lives intertwined by a single moment, each destined to be transformed forever as the airplane continued its ascent, carrying them toward a reckoning none of them could yet imagine. In the cramped economy seat near the rear restroom, Elijah sat silently, his anxiety intensifying with every minute. He stared blankly at his dark phone screen, its empty battery mocking him as he struggled with helplessness. Each passing moment seemed to tighten the invisible grip around his chest, suffocating his courage and leaving him feeling more isolated than ever. Then, suddenly, he felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. Startled, Elijah glanced up into the sympathetic face of a young woman seated next to him, a college student barely older than his older sister would have been. Her warm brown eyes held genuine kindness. "Hey," she whispered, holding out a portable charger with a small smile. "I overheard what happened earlier. Want to borrow this?" Elijah's eyes brightened instantly. Relief surged through him as he took the charger gratefully, his voice trembling slightly with gratitude. "Thank you so much." "No problem," she replied softly. "Don't let people like that get you down. You belong wherever your ticket says you belong." The young woman's words rekindled Elijah's waning spirit. He plugged his phone in urgently, waiting impatiently for the screen to flicker back to life. Seconds felt like eternity, but finally it glowed to life. Heart racing, Elijah quickly sent a message to his mother, Vivian Montgomery. "Mom, please help. The flight attendant humiliated me, took away my seat, and treated me terribly. I don't know what to do." Back on the ground in her sleek high-rise office, Vivian's phone buzzed sharply against the polished mahogany table. She glanced down casually at first, but her expression quickly darkened into something fierce, unreadable, and terrifyingly calm as she read Elijah's message. Vivian's silence sent a chill through her assistant, Lucas Bradford, who was standing nearby. "What's wrong, Ms. Montgomery?" Lucas asked cautiously. Vivian's voice was icy, edged with barely restrained fury. "Contact Captain Marcus Donovan immediately. My son has been mistreated by one of his crew members. This situation ends now." Without hesitation, Lucas dialed Captain Donovan's direct emergency line, connecting within seconds. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. "Captain Donovan, this is Lucas Bradford calling on behalf of Ms. Vivian Montgomery. Her son Elijah Bennett is aboard your flight. He's been severely mistreated by a crew member. She demands immediate action." In the cockpit, Captain Marcus Donovan's calm demeanor sharpened into intense seriousness. He had flown countless flights, faced endless minor inconveniences, but a call like this, from the airline's CEO herself, was unprecedented. He exhaled sharply, glancing briefly at his co-pilot, and nodded solemnly. "Understood, Mr. Bradford," Donovan replied evenly. "I'll address this personally." Within moments, Donovan spoke into the intercom, his authoritative voice echoing throughout the aircraft, reaching every passenger and crew member alike. "Rebecca Stanton, report immediately to the cockpit. Repeat, Ms. Stanton, report to the cockpit immediately." In the first-class cabin, Rebecca froze, her heart suddenly pounding fiercely in her chest. She had heard such announcements before, but never had her name been called out with such direct intensity. She glanced nervously at Sophie Mitchell, whose eyes widened in shock and quiet anticipation. "What's going on?" Sophie murmured softly. Rebecca ignored her, drawing herself up stiffly, masking her sudden anxiety with practiced confidence. "Just a routine matter, I'm sure," she replied dismissively, but her voice lacked the confidence she pretended to carry. Rebecca moved toward the cockpit, each step feeling heavier and colder. The eyes of passengers watched her silently, curiously, judgmentally, mirroring the way she herself had looked at Elijah earlier. She swallowed painfully, suddenly aware of a dawning sense of dread. Entering the cockpit, Rebecca found Captain Donovan's usually calm face filled with intense disappointment. He turned slightly toward her, motioning toward a small video monitor beside the control panel. The screen flickered briefly before the unmistakable face of Vivian Montgomery appeared, her powerful gaze locked firmly onto Rebecca. "Captain Donovan, thank you," Vivian said firmly, never breaking eye contact with Rebecca. "Now leave Miss Stanton with me. I want to speak to her directly." The captain nodded respectfully and stepped aside, but remained close enough to oversee the unfolding confrontation. Vivian leaned forward slightly, her voice dangerously calm yet sharp as steel. Ms. Stanton, do you have any idea what you have done? Rebecca's throat went dry instantly. Her mouth opened briefly, then closed, speechless. Vivian continued without waiting for a reply. You publicly humiliated my son, Elijah Bennett, and forced him out of his assigned first-class seat without verifying his boarding pass. You did not check the manifest or confirm his identity. You judged him purely based on assumptions, humiliating him publicly. Is this how you represent our airline? Rebecca, struggling to maintain composure, stammered defensively. Ms. Montgomery? Vivian cut her off sharply, her voice cold as ice. No, I'm not interested in your excuses. Here's what's going to happen next. You will return immediately to Elijah, apologize publicly in front of all passengers, and restore him to his original seat in first class. Rebecca felt her chest constrict painfully, her voice shaking. Ms. Montgomery, I sincerely apologize, but perhaps this could be handled quietly after landing. Vivian's response was instant, devastatingly firm. No. You humiliated him publicly, and you will make this right, publicly. If you refuse, security will escort you off the plane upon landing, and your employment will be terminated immediately. Are we clear? Rebecca's jaw tightened, panic flooding her system. Her worst fear had come true, her authority stripped, her career hanging by a thread. The humiliation she'd worked so desperately to avoid had caught up to her with merciless clarity. Yes, Ms. Montgomery, Rebecca finally whispered, voice trembling with defeat. Understood. Good, Vivian replied sharply. Now go. Rebecca stepped out of the cockpit, visibly shaken, her confidence shattered. Passengers stared openly as she made her way back through the cabin, humiliation burning fiercely on her cheeks. She had been wrong, painfully and publicly wrong, and now she was forced to face the consequence she had imposed on others for so long. Approaching Elijah's seat, Rebecca paused, swallowing hard before addressing him in a voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the cabin. Elijah Bennett, I owe you an apology. I made a serious mistake by not verifying your boarding pass and treating you unjustly. Your seat in first class awaits you. Please allow me to escort you back. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Elijah stood slowly, the calm dignity he had maintained throughout the flight now radiating strength rather than vulnerability. Passengers watched silently, eyes wide with realization, embarrassment, and shame, finally seeing their complicity in Rebecca's injustice. As Elijah walked back toward first class, head held high, the tables had irrevocably turned. Rebecca Stanton, once so powerful and feared, was left standing silently at the back of the plane, facing a truth she desperately avoided. In seeking to avoid humiliation, she had created it herself, and now everyone knew. Rebecca Stanton stood frozen in the aisle, the oppressive silence of the cabin pressing down on her from all directions. All eyes were fixed upon her now, curious, judgmental, and impatient. She had spent her career controlling situations like this, wielding authority as armor against humiliation, but today that armor had been stripped away completely, leaving her vulnerable and exposed, a person she hardly recognized anymore. She swallowed hard, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. Elijah sat silently in his reclaimed first-class seat, his expression calm yet piercing. Passengers around them leaned in slightly, sensing the gravity of the moment unfolding before them. Rebecca forced herself to speak, though each word was bitterly difficult. Elijah Bennett, earlier today I made a serious mistake. I accused you wrongly, humiliated you unfairly, and acted unprofessionally. For that, I apologize. Her voice was stiff, mechanical, clearly not coming from the heart. The words felt like ash in her mouth, empty and meaningless. Elijah listened quietly, his young face calm yet profoundly thoughtful. He hesitated for only a brief moment, then lifted his eyes to meet hers directly. Miss Stanton, Elijah spoke calmly, his voice strong and clear enough to carry throughout the entire cabin. Are you apologizing because you genuinely realize what you did was wrong, or are you saying sorry because you're being forced to? The question landed heavily, like a stone thrown into still water, rippling throughout the cabin. Passengers shifted uneasily, murmuring among themselves. Many lowered their eyes, suddenly ashamed of their earlier silence, recognizing now their own complicity in Elijah's humiliation. Rebecca's face reddened visibly. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no sound came out. Elijah's simple yet powerful question left her utterly defenseless. She had no prepared answer for authenticity, only excuses and denials. Her authority crumbled in that moment, exposing not just her actions, but the deeper prejudice behind them. The silence stretched painfully until Rebecca looked away, her gaze lowered in defeat. She couldn't answer truthfully. Her pride, her fear, her stubbornness stopped her from admitting what everyone now clearly saw. Her apology wasn't sincere. It was forced. Seeing Rebecca falter, passengers became restless. Their whispers grew louder, becoming accusations and angry murmurs. It was clear that the collective mood had shifted. Rebecca's veneer of professionalism had cracked entirely, revealing deep and troubling biases beneath. Then, amidst the rising tension, another voice broke the silence. Quiet at first, then growing steadily stronger. Sophie Mitchell stepped forward hesitantly, visibly trembling, but her eyes filled with a fierce determination. Her soft voice quickly became firm, ringing clearly through the cabin. "I need to say something," Sophie began, glancing nervously around the aircraft. "I've only been working here a short while and I've already seen enough. Today wasn't an isolated incident. Ms. Stanton has a habit of treating passengers unfairly, especially younger people, or passengers she personally judges unworthy. She pressures staff like me into silence, threatening our jobs if we speak out." Passengers turned in shock, eyes widening in disbelief and dismay at Sophie's courageous admission. Sophie continued, her voice stronger now, gaining courage from the truth finally spoken aloud. "I watched Elijah being humiliated and I stayed silent because I was scared. But silence is part of the problem. Rebecca Stanton has been allowed to do this repeatedly because people like me were too afraid to speak up. It's not right. Elijah deserves better." Sophie's words resonated deeply. Passengers nodded in agreement, some clapping quietly in support. Sophie felt a rush of relief and pride at finally speaking her truth, standing tall despite the emotional storm inside her. Rebecca's face paled completely, her authority dissolving entirely under the weight of Sophie's accusations. There was nowhere left to hide. The mask she had worn for so many years shattered before everyone, exposing the flawed, frightened woman behind the cold persona. Captain Marcus Donovan emerged from the cockpit into the first-class cabin, his calm authority settling the growing tension. He had been silently observing, and now he spoke clearly, addressing everyone on board. "Passengers," Captain Donovan said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Today, a serious wrong has been addressed. Our airline does not tolerate discrimination or prejudice of any kind. Elijah Bennett was wrongly treated, and this injustice should never have occurred." He then turned toward the elderly gentleman who had bravely stood up for Elijah earlier in the flight. Captain Donovan offered him a respectful smile, gesturing warmly toward an empty first-class seat. "Sir, thank you for standing up for what's right. It takes true courage to intervene when others remain silent. Please, allow me the honor of upgrading you to first class for the remainder of your flight." The elderly passenger rose humbly, visibly moved by the acknowledgement, and moved forward to his new seat amidst approving applause from fellow passengers. Elijah met the gentleman's eyes, gratitude and respect shared silently between them. Rebecca, isolated and powerless, stepped back quietly, trying desperately to disappear into the shadows. Her career, her reputation, everything she'd built by enforcing authority through intimidation, now lay in ruins. But this was more than a personal defeat. It was a moral reckoning, an overdue moment of accountability she could no longer avoid. Elijah watched her quietly withdraw, but felt no joy or triumph in her downfall, only sadness that prejudice had made her blind to compassion. He glanced over at Sophie, nodding softly in silent gratitude. Sophie nodded back, both understanding the quiet strength that comes from courageously confronting injustice. As the plane descended slowly toward its destination, the atmosphere on board felt profoundly different. Passengers who had initially been passive now engaged openly, reflecting thoughtfully upon their roles as bystanders. Elijah's courage had awakened something meaningful in everyone, a renewed understanding that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, and that every voice mattered. In that moment, Elijah understood the power he possessed, not because his mother was the CEO of the airline, but simply because he had chosen to speak up, challenging injustice openly. He realized that real authority wasn't about control or intimidation. It was about integrity, fairness, and courage. The aircraft wheels gently touched the runway, bringing an end to an unforgettable flight. As passengers rose quietly, exchanging thoughtful glances and conversations, Elijah felt pride and relief. This wasn't merely an apology forced from a stubborn flight attendant. This was genuine, meaningful justice, finally being served. Today, Elijah Bennett had not only reclaimed his seat in first class, he had reclaimed his dignity and inspired others to reclaim theirs. The flight had ended, but its impact would carry forward, changing hearts and minds long after everyone had stepped off the plane. As the plane taxied slowly toward the gate, Rebecca Stanton sat silently in the crew seat near the front cabin, staring down at her hands clasped tightly on her lap. For once, her pride and defensiveness had abandoned her completely, leaving her exposed, humbled, and deeply shaken. She'd spent her career building walls to keep criticism and failure at bay, yet now, in a single flight, those walls had crumbled, leaving her forced to confront the painful truth she had long avoided. Once the plane stopped at the gate, the cockpit door swung open again, revealing Captain Marcus Donovan, his expression grave yet compassionate. "Rebecca," he spoke quietly, his tone firm but not unkind. "You need to come with me. HR representatives are already here." Rebecca rose stiffly, heart pounding, aware that every passenger's eyes were fixed upon her once more. She walked off the plane, escorted quietly toward a private room where human resources representatives awaited her arrival. There was no dramatic confrontation, only the quiet yet firm instructions that her employment was suspended immediately, pending an internal review. Her punishment didn't end there. Rebecca soon learned she would be required to attend extensive anti-bias training, a comprehensive program intended not merely to punish but to educate, to help her confront the underlying prejudices that had led to her devastating misjudgment. More than that, she would need to publicly acknowledge her actions and issue a formal written apology, not just to Elijah Bennett, but to everyone impacted by her prejudice. She was not allowed to leave the airport until the process began. At first, Rebecca fought silently within herself, still trying to justify her behavior, still searching for excuses that would soften the blow to her ego. But when she finally sat alone in the stark meeting room, faced with writing her apology, something inside her began to shift. Slowly, painfully, she confronted the uncomfortable truth. The root cause of her behavior wasn't policy or past passenger incidents. It was prejudice she'd carried silently within herself, an unwillingness to examine or acknowledge her own biases. As she wrote the apology, tears blurred her vision, driven by shame, not just for her actions, but for her persistent denial. For the first time, Rebecca saw clearly the damage her attitudes caused, not only to Elijah but to herself and those around her. In facing her shame, she took her first true step toward meaningful change, recognizing that real authority came not from strict control, but from genuine empathy, fairness, and respect. Eupheме. Meanwhile, Vivian Montgomery stood confidently beside her son Elijah at the arrivals area, warmly greeting him as he stepped off the plane. She hugged him gently, pride clear in her eyes. Elijah smiled softly, tired yet profoundly grateful for the comforting strength his mother provided. "I'm proud of you," Vivian whispered softly. "You handled yourself with dignity, courage, and maturity far beyond your years." Elijah nodded, thoughtful. "I learned something important today," he said quietly. "It's not enough to wait for someone else to speak up. We have to be the ones brave enough to start the conversation." Vivian smiled warmly, seeing clearly the growth that this difficult experience had sparked within her son. Inspired by Elijah's courage, Vivian was determined to ensure this incident was more than just a single story. It would become the catalyst for real and lasting change within the airline she led. The following morning, Vivian Montgomery called a press conference, standing confidently before the gathered media representatives. She openly acknowledged the airline's responsibility for what happened, refusing to minimize or excuse the incident. Instead, she pledged immediate and sweeping changes. "Today," Vivian announced clearly, "we introduce comprehensive, mandatory anti-bias and discrimination training across every level of our airline. No passenger or employee should ever endure what my son experienced. But we know Elijah was fortunate. He had the means to fight back. We recognize there are countless others who suffer quietly, unable to speak up. This stops now." Her words resonated profoundly, broadcast widely across television, radio, and social media platforms, sparking intense conversations about implicit bias and the responsibilities of organizations everywhere. Elijah, watching from the side of the stage, felt a newfound purpose rising within him. This experience had challenged him deeply but also revealed his potential for positive influence. He decided in that moment to use his story as a platform, not to seek personal justice, but to provide a voice for countless others who faced similar injustices in silence. With his mother's guidance, Elijah began creating an online platform, a safe and supportive forum where individuals could share their experiences of discrimination, injustice, and prejudice. The platform quickly gained momentum, attracting countless stories from others who felt empowered by Elijah's bravery. His courageous stand inspired them to speak openly, finding solidarity, support, and solutions together. Soon, Elijah's simple online forum became a significant force for change, a place where people who once felt voiceless found community and strength. Schools, workplaces, and organizations worldwide began to embrace Elijah's story as a powerful example of the importance of speaking out against injustice wherever it was encountered. Back at the airline, Sophie Mitchell stood taller and stronger after that memorable flight. Elijah's courage had transformed her too, helping her find her own voice, finally enabling her to stand up against injustice and prejudice openly. She volunteered to lead internal staff conversations about the importance of speaking up, sharing her own difficult journey toward courage. Her story resonated deeply, encouraging others to examine their own complicity and responsibility in confronting injustice. As for Rebecca Stanton, months later she quietly returned to her work, humbled and profoundly changed. Now openly sharing her story during anti-bias training sessions, she bravely admitted her mistakes, using herself as an example of how unconscious prejudices could cause deep harm. This willingness to be vulnerable not only rebuilt her integrity, but gave her a more meaningful sense of authority, the kind born from true empathy, self-awareness, and humility. The lessons learned from Elijah's experience were profound and lasting, spreading far beyond a single airline incident. Passengers, crew members, executives, and everyday people who heard the story were compelled to reflect deeply on their own biases and responsibilities. Elijah Bennett had unknowingly ignited a powerful wave of change, one that reshaped attitudes, behaviors, and ultimately the very culture that allowed injustice to persist. As Elijah lay in bed that night, reflecting quietly on everything that had unfolded, he felt a profound sense of peace. He now understood clearly. True power wasn't about status or influence. It came from authenticity, courage, and the willingness to speak truth, especially when it was difficult. Elijah closed his eyes, knowing that while this particular flight had ended, his journey was only beginning, and that was something truly worth fighting for. In the days and weeks that followed Elijah Bennett's widely publicized ordeal, something remarkable began to happen among the very passengers who had silently witnessed the injustice aboard that unforgettable flight. Initially, many of them returned home quietly, carrying a heavy sense of shame and remorse for their inaction. The silence they'd chosen in that critical moment had not vanished with the landing of the plane. It lingered, gnawed at their conscience, and eventually compelled them to take meaningful action. One by one, passengers began stepping forward to openly acknowledge their complicity. Some passengers took to social media to post heartfelt apologies directly to Elijah, revealing their regret for remaining silent witnesses. Their candid, vulnerable admissions became powerful moments of collective reckoning. They spoke candidly about the guilt that had haunted them since that day and how this incident had profoundly impacted their perspectives on social responsibility and moral courage. A mother who had been sitting a few rows away from Elijah wrote an emotional open letter that quickly gained traction online. "I watched in silence as a young boy was humiliated," she confessed, her words heavy with remorse. "In that moment, I taught my own children that silence in the face of injustice was acceptable. I was wrong. Elijah's bravery opened my eyes, and from this day forward I vow never to remain silent again." Her powerful admission was soon echoed by others, business executives, teachers, parents, and students, all who recognized themselves in her words. Inspired by these shared stories, many passengers reached out directly to Elijah, sending him letters and emails, sharing their own experiences and heartfelt apologies. Elijah read each message carefully, humbled and moved by their sincerity. Far from harboring resentment, he replied graciously, encouraging them to channel their guilt into meaningful action. Inspired by Elijah's generous response, several of these passengers began organizing community gatherings, small groups of individuals who came together voluntarily, determined to educate themselves on implicit bias and discrimination. They invited speakers from human rights organizations and professional facilitators trained in anti-discrimination education. At first, these sessions were modest, intimate meetings held in living rooms or community halls, but soon word spread, attendance grew, and their small local gatherings expanded into powerful regional movements. Each group took on new initiatives, working actively to raise awareness about the importance of standing up against prejudice in everyday life. They organized workshops in local schools, created educational pamphlets to distribute within their communities, and partnered with nonprofit organizations to host anti-bias training seminars open to the public. Volunteers shared their own stories openly, using the painful memory of Elijah's flight as a catalyst to help others understand the immense harm caused by remaining passive observers to injustice. The ripple effect soon spread far beyond those initial passengers. Schools, community centers, and even corporations began contacting these grassroots organizers, requesting their assistance in launching similar programs nationwide. Elijah's story, initially a single incident, had now become the cornerstone of a powerful nationwide dialogue about individual accountability and moral courage. But the transformation didn't stop within communities alone. The story rapidly reached social media platforms, propelled by trending hashtags like Speak Up for Justice and Elijah's Story. Within days, millions of users globally had joined the conversation, sharing their own experiences of injustice and the importance of confronting silence. Prominent social activists, celebrities, and influential public figures soon lent their voices to the movement. Renowned civil rights advocates tweeted their support, emphasizing how Elijah's courage embodied the critical need to speak out against prejudice. Celebrities shared Elijah's story across their massive platforms, praising his bravery and calling upon their followers to never remain silent in similar situations. Politicians across the ideological spectrum cited Elijah's experience in speeches, urging legislative changes to reinforce anti-discrimination policies in transportation, schools, and workplaces. One prominent political figure declared in a widely broadcasted speech, "Elijah Bennett's courage revealed something critical about our society, that the cost of silence in the face of injustice is far greater than the discomfort of speaking out. Elijah has taught us all that we cannot wait for others to act. We must be the change ourselves." As awareness continued to grow, Elijah's social media pages became inundated with messages from people of all ages, backgrounds, and nationalities, sharing personal stories of times they had remained silent and now deeply regretted it. They thanked him for showing the world the necessity of courage and compassion, and pledged publicly that his experience had inspired them to break their own silence. Amid this remarkable global dialogue, Elijah's online forum, which he'd created with his mother Vivian Montgomery's guidance, quickly blossomed into an international community. It became a platform where thousands found the confidence to speak up, share their stories, and support one another. Elijah carefully curated the community, ensuring it remained positive, empowering, and constructive, transforming personal pain into collective growth and actionable solutions. The wave of activism eventually influenced the airline industry itself, prompting numerous airlines around the world to publicly reevaluate their customer service policies and anti-discrimination training programs. Companies began to recognize the critical importance of actively combating unconscious bias at every level, from customer-facing roles to executive management. Vivian Montgomery's airline, where Elijah's story began, proudly led this transformative wave. Vivian ensured her company became an industry-wide role model, publicly transparent about policy changes and committed to ongoing accountability. She frequently credited her son's courage and the passengers' grassroots activism for catalyzing this unprecedented shift. Months later, passengers who had originally witnessed Elijah's mistreatment reunited at a special event organized by Vivian's airline, publicly acknowledging their personal growth and transformation. Elijah spoke eloquently at the event, thanking everyone present, not just for their apologies, but for their willingness to evolve and take responsibility. In closing, Elijah reminded everyone of the powerful lesson they had collectively learned. Silence is comfortable, but comfort rarely changes the world. The courage to speak, even when your voice shakes, creates the ripples that change hearts, minds, and ultimately, society. His simple, heartfelt words resonated deeply, capturing the essence of a movement sparked by one courageous boy, a remorseful community, and the collective realization that true justice only thrives when everyone is brave enough to speak up. Elijah's story was no longer merely about one boy's experience. It had become the catalyst for a lasting global dialogue, uniting countless voices and proving once and for all that the greatest change begins the moment one person refuses to remain silent. What happened to Elijah Bennett on that seemingly ordinary flight reveals far more than the story of one mistreated young passenger. It serves as a stark reminder that even in today's world, discrimination, prejudice, and injustice remain tragically widespread. Embedded deeply, silently, yet powerfully within societies across the globe. Today, discrimination is not simply the product of individual malice or isolated prejudice. It is systemic, ingrained within our institutions, policies, workplaces, and even the subtle interactions of everyday life. Discrimination is a shadow that trails behind countless individuals, judging them unfairly based solely on appearance, background, beliefs, or identity. Every single day, millions around the globe suffer quietly, their dignity chipped away piece by painful piece. Sometimes these injustices are loud, aggressive, and undeniable, but often they are quiet, insidious, hidden beneath superficial politeness. much like what Elijah experienced on that airplane, an invisible prejudice cloaked under authority and respectability. Imagine for a moment what it must feel like to wake up each morning knowing the world you walk into sees you not as who you truly are, but as a stereotype, an assumption, a category. Imagine carrying the weight of prejudice wherever you go. Not because of anything you've done, but simply because of who society believes you to be. This is the harsh reality for millions who are judged for their ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, gender, disability, or simply because of differences that others find uncomfortable. Stories of prejudice are not rare. They happen every day in cities, towns, workplaces, and schools across the globe. There is the woman whose job application is tossed aside simply because of her name, the student excluded and mocked because they speak differently, the man whose competence is questioned solely due to his appearance, and countless more who silently endure humiliation and unfairness in fear of further reprisal. The injustice Elijah faced is not exceptional. It is tragically commonplace. Every moment, someone else faces similar humiliation, shame, and isolation. Yet too often, the world remains silent. The painful cost of silence. Elijah's experience on that airplane highlighted an even deeper tragedy, the silence of those who witness injustice yet choose to remain passive. When we stay silent in moments of unfairness, we inadvertently endorse it. Silence emboldens discrimination, allowing it to continue unchecked and unnoticed. Silence says clearly, if unintentionally, this is acceptable. This is normal. Consider all the people aboard Elijah's flight who saw clearly what was unfolding, yet chose silence over confrontation. Their silence did not just fail Elijah. It failed the fundamental principles of empathy, compassion, and justice. It was that silence, multiplied across countless instances and individuals, which allows injustice and prejudice to thrive in our world today. History teaches us repeatedly that injustice grows strongest in environments where silence reigns. It gains strength not merely from perpetrators, but from the passivity of those who observe without intervening. We must recognize that silence is never neutral. It is complicit. In our passivity, we unwittingly empower injustice, allowing it to spread unchecked, deepening wounds that may never fully heal. We must break the cycle. But there is hope. Change begins the moment a single person decides they will no longer remain silent in the face of unfairness. Every monumental social movement began with individuals brave enough to confront injustice openly and boldly, refusing to accept prejudice as inevitable. History is shaped by courageous individuals who understood clearly that silence is betrayal, that remaining passive is unacceptable. Our world today desperately needs more voices willing to confront discrimination and prejudice fearlessly. We must collectively summon the courage to step forward, raise our voices, and make clear that injustice will not go unchallenged. We must stop seeing injustice as someone else's problem. We must embrace it as our shared responsibility, each and every one of us accountable for creating a fairer, kinder world. The fight against prejudice and discrimination is never someone else's battle. It is ours, right here, right now. The power of speaking up. Consider what happened when Elijah's story went viral, when one young boy's experience became an international symbol of courage and accountability. It revealed how powerful it is when ordinary people choose bravery over silence. Elijah, despite being young, chose to face injustice directly. His courage empowered millions, inspiring passengers aboard that very flight and countless others to confront their own biases, reflect deeply, and speak openly about their complicity in silence. It sparked meaningful conversations in homes, schools, workplaces, and social media platforms worldwide. Elijah's story prompted major corporations, airlines, schools, and communities to openly discuss and confront bias, implementing policies and programs to educate and eliminate discrimination. That is the power one voice can hold. Now imagine if each of us found our voice in a similar way, committed fully to justice and fairness in our everyday lives. Imagine how transformative it would be if we collectively vowed never to remain silent again. If we decided that standing up against injustice was not only possible, but essential. Change starts with you. Right now, you have the power to stand against discrimination in your life and community. It doesn't matter who you are, where you live, or how small you think your influence might be. Change always begins at the individual level, with courage, empathy, and determination. It begins with your voice, your actions, your willingness to confront unfairness when it appears before you. Take active steps today. Educate yourself and others around you about implicit bias and discrimination. Refuse to be a passive bystander. Intervene respectfully but firmly when you witness injustice or prejudice in your daily life. Encourage conversations about prejudice, even when uncomfortable. Support policies, organizations, and leaders who openly fight discrimination. Use your platforms, social media, workplace, schools, communities, to share stories of courage, accountability, and fairness. The world we can create. Imagine a world in which Elijah's experience is no longer common. Imagine societies that prioritize empathy, fairness, and genuine respect for all individuals. Imagine future generations growing up in environments where discrimination is not tolerated, where differences are embraced as strengths rather than sources of prejudice. This world is achievable, but it depends entirely on us, today, having the courage to speak clearly and firmly, to challenge injustice wherever it appears, and to never remain silent when witnessing prejudice or discrimination. Your voice matters. Never underestimate the power you hold. Every courageous word you speak inspires someone else to find their courage. Your bravery can ignite a chain reaction, creating ripples of compassion, accountability, and justice, extending far beyond your immediate circle. Your voice can awaken a movement. It can change lives. It can challenge systems. Your voice matters. Not tomorrow, not someday, but right here, right now. Our shared responsibility. So, let us no longer remain passive observers. Let us become agents of change, builders of fairness, and defenders of dignity. Let Elijah's bravery be a powerful reminder of our collective responsibility. Let his courage motivate us to act bravely, compassionately, and consistently. We must stand up and declare, no more silence, no more passive acceptance, no more complicity. Together we must be the voices that challenge unfairness, prejudice, and injustice. Together we must build a better world, not only for ourselves, but for generations to come. Join the movement today. Elijah's story has shown clearly that even small actions can spark powerful transformations. It is now your turn to carry that flame forward, lighting paths of fairness and compassion everywhere you go. Stand tall, speak boldly, act courageously. We cannot wait another day to begin. The time to act against discrimination is now. Let your actions today inspire countless others tomorrow. Reflect and share your voice. Finally, we invite you to briefly reflect in the comments. What will you personally do when facing injustice? Does everyone, even someone like Rebecca Stanton, deserve the opportunity to redeem themselves, to learn, and to grow? Have you experienced injustice or prejudice personally? If comfortable, briefly share your experience and how it shaped you. Your reflections, even briefly shared, can inspire someone else to act. Thank you for joining this critical movement toward fairness and justice. Let us never remain silent again.